Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this two lectures by Professor David Archard on procreation and ethics. So the first talk will be on freedom to procreate, and the second one after the break will be on limits to procreative choice. Let me say a few words about Dave, and although he really needs no introduction, Professor Dave Archard is Professor of Philosophy at Queen's University, Belfast, UK, and he has previously taught at the University of Ulster, St. Andrew University, and Lancaster University, having been a chair professor at Lancaster University. And now he is a chair professor at Queen's University. He has published widely on a range of topics, including applied ethics, political and legal philosophy. And in particular, he focuses on the topics of procreative ethics, consent, and children's rights, and family and the state. The third edition of his book, Children, Childhood and Rights, was published in 2014. He's a vice president of the Society for Applied Philosophy, and deputy chair of the UK's Human Fertilization and Embryology Authority. He also has been a member of the Nuffield Council, which is often called or known as the British think tank in bioethics. Without further ado, let's welcome Professor David Archard.
Thank you. I've made the terrible mistake of coming without my glasses, so I have to stand here because I can just about read that. Okay, so my apologies. The area of procreative ethics, or the ethics of creating human beings, is an area about which there has been a lot of writing in recent years. Maybe 20, 25 years ago, whoops, you wouldn't find much written. Now, huge amounts is written. And I want to introduce you to some of the debates. And in the first lecture, I'm going to be looking at the idea of a right to create children. And I want to also introduce you to a standard view now in bioethics about when it's wrong to create a child. Now, that view is quite complicated in philosophical terms, so I'm going to take you through it very simply, and hopefully you'll see why it's a puzzle, and why for many people there's no solution to the problem. So, if you opened any book on reproductive ethics 10, 15, 20 years ago, it was standardly asserted at the beginning, there is a right to procreate, to have children. But I am very doubtful there is such a right. And I'm certainly not sure what the supposed justification of that right is, and I'm not sure what limits there are. So let me start by making a number of distinctions that are important to make to get clear about what is being claimed. So I'm so used to using the Greek term phi, but it's standard in the literature. You may think, for instance, that there is no right to do something or to have something, but that nevertheless the costs, and I mean here the moral costs, of preventing individuals from doing that thing are too great or unconscionable. So you might think, for instance, there's no right to procreate, but it's just impossible to stop people from procreating. Or the costs of trying to stop people from procreating are too great. Second important distinction in the literature is between negative and positive freedoms. So standardly, a negative freedom is a freedom not to be prevented or stopped from doing or having something. A positive freedom is a right to help or assistance in doing that thing. So take a simple example that I've used in published work. I have a right to travel as a UK citizen. I have a passport. That means I can travel across borders. What the right consists of is a right not to be stopped from traveling. But the UK government is under no duty to help me travel. Okay, they're not obligated to pay for my journeys abroad. Now, why is that important? Well, because in the case of procreation, you might think there's a standard negative right not to be stopped from having children, but that's entirely different from a right to be helped to have children. Now, as mentioned by Hon, that outside my university work, I sit on a UK body called the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Authority, the HFEA for short. I'm currently its deputy chair, and in the second lecture, I'll introduce some problems that arise from one of the committees I chair, which has to do with genetic choice. Now, fertility treatment in the UK, that is, for those couples who cannot naturally have children, you can go to clinics for help in having children. I've seen similar arrangements in Hong Kong. But provision for free fertility treatment is actually quite constrained and difficult. And fertility treatment in a private clinic is very expensive. It's about, it depends on all the add-ons, but it's about, let's say, £8,000, which would be 80,000 Hong Kong dollars for a cycle of treatment. So it's very expensive. And one thought is, well, why should the government pay for you to have fertility treatment? Right. Okay. It seems to me that if you talk about a right to have children, you can't mean a right to have as many as you want. Now, why? Well, any interest I might have in having a child certainly has a certain weight and power, but it doesn't seem that it has the same weight and power of having lots of children. Equally, there are reasons not to allow unlimited procreation. That is, not to allow people to have as many children as they want. One has to do with the welfare of children. The more children you have, the more difficult it might be for parents to care for the children. And clearly there's a problem about population size, especially in the context of scarce resources. I'm aware, you're aware, that China had a one-child policy, which was motivated by concerns about limiting population. And there are some philosophers who've argued that there is no right to have children in the current context simply because of the problems there are about using up scarce resources. Why might you think there's a right to procreate or freedom to have children? Well, it might seem a good thing that humans do procreate because that ensures that the human species continues. Right? Why is it good that we have children? Because if we didn't, humanity would come to an end. Now, there are at least some philosophers, David Benatar, who I'll look at in the second lecture, and Jimmy Lenman, who've argued it's not obviously a bad thing if humanity came to an end. If the human species did cease, that might not be a bad thing. But if it is good that human beings exist, that's different from the claim that it's a good thing that each of us individually can have children. Okay? So it might be good that some individuals procreate, because then humanity continues. That's a different claim from it's good for each of us that we have children. It's also important to distinguish between two senses of having children. A lot of the earlier writers run two things together. One thing you might mean by having children is procreating, creating new human beings. But you also mean by having children looking after them, being their guardians, being their custodians. They're two different things. So for instance, one thing I'm very aware of in the UK is that there are people who donate gametes, which can be used by other couples who are not able themselves to have children. And there are interesting groups of people who do that, not huge numbers, but you can at least think of somebody who thought, I want other people to have children, but I don't want children myself. So I'm quite happy to create children for other people, but I don't want myself to ever have a child and bring it up. Okay, why might you think it's good to create, to bring into existence children? Well, one thought you get in the literature is, well, this is a great creative act. It's one of the most incredible things you can do is to create another human beings. But actually, it's not a particularly creative act in the way that an artist might create a work of art. All that you're doing is passing on to the next generation your genes, and you've inherited those genes from your parents, and they inherited those genes from their parents. So there isn't a great deal of creativity here. You're simply bringing into existence somebody with genes you didn't choose and which were given to you by your parents. You get a lovely phrase in English, particularly in the sort of 19th century, continuing the bloodline. It's very unclear why that is valuable to the person who procreates, rather than to others who may benefit from the fact that certain kinds of genes are passed on. There are some genes that it might not be very good to pass on, for all kinds of reasons. More standardly, you find a claim that there is a very important, basic desire to have children. And many human beings will say, it's really, really important to me that I have children, that I create children, that I bring into existence my children. And the reason we can talk about a right or a freedom to procreate is because of that very fundamental desire that many people feel. And for instance, those who use fertility treatment in the UK can spend sometimes up to £100,000 trying to have children, trying to have their own biological children. It's very expensive, it has medical risks, it's immensely time-consuming, and it can be very frustrating. But they will say, look, what really, really matters to me is that I am a parent, that I can create a child. That claim has been criticized by philosophers, and in particular by feminists, who want to argue that the desire some people feel, particularly women, to have children, the sense such women have that they're not complete, that their lives are not fulfilled, that their lives are not flourishing unless they have children, that is a desire that's very much a product of social pressures. There's been lots of debates in the UK newspapers recently about the pressure on women to have children. You must know Jennifer Aniston, the actress, gave this wonderful interview because she was photographed on a holiday in a bikini, and because she had a slightly large stomach, there was huge speculation. Is Jennifer pregnant at last? Okay. She wrote this wonderful statement. She said, first of all, I'm not pregnant. That was a very nice lunch. Okay. Secondly, I really resent the pressure on me and on all women to have children. When I want children, then I will let you know. A lot of women have protested that they are represented as unfulfilled, incomplete without children. So if we appeal to the idea of some basic desire, the reply will be, well, where does that come from? And is it authentic? Is it genuine? All right, let me just give you a nice American, enough philosophy, some American legal cases and British legal cases we'll have a look at. This is a great case from 1942, Skinner versus Oklahoma, and it was a judgment that it was wrong of the state to allow involuntary sterilization in the case of criminals. The thought was, we don't want those who are convicted of serious crimes to pass on their genes. Okay? There was a time of believing in certain crude eugenics. Criminals have bad genes, let's stop them from passing on, let's not have another generation. So they were sterilized against their wishes and against their will. And the judgment was that was wrong. Okay? And it's a nice case to look at because of the ways you can examine the costs of limiting procreation. I mean, the first thing to say is sterilizing somebody is a permanent, it's a lifelong deprivation of a basic individual liberty. I think I said in the previous lectures the example of vasectomies. Vasectomies can render a man sterile. They are reversible, but with risks and costs. We might think it permissible, by contrast with sterilization, to say that you don't have an unconstrained liberty to procreate. We're going to allow you to procreate in some circumstances, but not in others. We might allow you to procreate to have one child, but not to have many children. And we could try to do that by attaching costs to procreation, such as economic costs. And that won't amount to sterilization, as was the case in Skinner versus Oklahoma. The worry in the Supreme Court case was that it was predominantly blacks who were being sterilized, because the biggest percentage of criminals in US jails are black. So the effect of allowing sterilization was that it was discriminatory on racial grounds, and that was weighed very heavily with the judges. But denying one particular individual the right to have children need not have those kinds of moral costs. We might not be permanently depriving them of the right to have children, and we might not be doing so on discriminatory grounds. I'm in print as being very skeptical about the right to procreate. So let me tell you why. I'm not clear there's a genuine universal interest in procreating. I'm not sure it's one that every individual has. There may well be an interest of humanity in continuing to exist, but that doesn't seem to me straightforwardly gives you an interest of every individual. There are very many bad reasons to procreate. Okay. To save a marriage. If anybody reads books or looks at films, you'll know there are cases where a couple will decide to give it another go, and they'll decide to have another child or to have a child in order to keep themselves together. You might have a child to get back at somebody, to spite them, to trap them into marriage in the first place. I put to honor one's own parents, because I'm very well aware there's a long tradition in China of having children as a way of honoring your own parents, of being yourself a parent. You might do it to prove it can be done. You might do it to secure love and support from others. Some years ago in the UK, there was a claim by some politicians that the only reason some people had children was in order to get housing or to get welfare payments. It's actually false, but it was a very, very influential claim. And it was directed particularly at young, unmarried girls. Why are they having children? Well, that way they get a house. Most importantly, I'm going to come back to this, procreation is bringing into existence another human being, and the condition of existing is one of being vulnerable, vulnerable to harms, dependent on others, and what David Velleman calls exposed to the precariousness of existence. It's not guaranteed when you're brought into existence that life will go well for you. It could go badly. That's a really risky step to take, to bring into existence another human being whose life might be a very bad one. So now I'm going to introduce you to the puzzle, and I'm more than happy in the discussion time to come back and do it again and to go over it. So this view is extremely influential, and I take it as the orthodox view. It's the view that most who write in bioethics hold to. I'm one who doesn't. Okay, and I have an attempted answer to the puzzle, but I'm not sure it works. So if you have another answer, let me know. Okay, so we're going to go through a number of claims, and again, I'm happy to come back to each of them, but together they have a pretty awful implication, which I'll try and show you. Okay. The first is the view that you can only wrong someone, you can only do wrong to someone if you harm them. It's quite influential in moral theory. Secondly, what does it mean to harm somebody? It means you make them worse off. So this is a kind of comparative construal of harm. So if I'm going to pick poor Hon as the example. If I strike Hon and injure him, I harm him. Why? Because I make him worse off. I give him bruises or a broken nose or loss of blood. I worsen his condition. If I steal from Hon, I again harm him because I make him worse off, because he now doesn't have property he had before, rightly. So it's a standard view that you wrong someone if you harm them, and you harm them if you make them worse off. All right? Right. Third, if you are considering procreation, what are the choices open to you? You can either choose what people will call a two-option choice, that is, procreate or don't procreate. All right? That's straightforward. All right? The only other possibility is what is called a three-option choice, which is don't procreate, procreate now, or procreate at some other time. All right? So, for instance, a lot of women are using fertility treatment to delay procreation. Okay? They will, for instance, freeze their eggs because they want to be a mother later, not 25 years, but when they're 25 years old, but maybe 40, 45. And they'll do so because they want to pursue their career. So they want to delay procreation. So either you can, the choices you face are don't procreate, don't have any children, or have children now in these present circumstances, or do so later in different circumstances. Those are the only possibilities. Right. This one really bugs people. Right. If you don't procreate, no child comes into existence. All right? What is non-existence? What do we mean by non-existence? Well, what we're interested in is how bad is it not to exist? Now, either you can compare non-existence with existence, and you can say, I exist, and I can compare my existing now with a situation in which I never came into existence. Or you say, I can't make that comparison. It doesn't make any sense to me. I don't understand what that means. Indeed, a judge in an English wrongful life case said, I can't make sense of that claim. What would it be like if the child had never existed? It's a puzzle. Okay. You'll see why that matters. And lastly, everybody's favorite, what is called the non-identity condition, and is due to Derek Parfit. And it's very, very simple. I actually think the non-identity condition is pretty straightforward. It's when it's combined with all the others it causes us problems. Parfit says, if you delay procreating, let's take this straightforward. Let's say I decide to procreate in a year's time, not now. Right? The child I will create in a year's time is not a different version of the child I could have created now. It's a totally different child. There is non-identity between the possible child now and the possible child later. That's all the non-identity condition means. And he argues it's plausible given some fairly standard views about genetic identity. Okay. Now, if you take all 5 together, you need all 5, you end up with this. I only do wrong if I create an individual whose life is worse than non-existence. And that has to be very, very bad indeed. Yes?
Why do you need E?
What?
Why can't we go from A to D and come to the conclusion? Why do you need E?
Why do you need E?
Yeah.
For a reason you'll see.
Okay, thanks.
I hope. Why it does the work, why it turns the argument in a certain kind of way. And it has to do with comparisons. Do you want the down, dirty, advance, and quick? Which is, if I choose, Parfit's famous example was, consider, he said, a case in which someone is told, if you procreate now, as a woman, if you procreate now and create a child, that child will have a serious disability. Serious illness. But if you delay procreation and take a course of drugs, then the child you create will be free of that disability, will be healthy. What should you do? Seems very clear the woman should delay. Why? Because clearly, better to have in the world a child without the disability than a child with the disability. But what E gives you is the impossibility of saying that you've made the child worse off by creating it now. Because these are 2 different children. They're not identical. So you're not worsening the condition of anybody. Right? So, if I had the child now with the disability, and the child said, how could you create me? Because you've created me with a disability. The parent who has read Parfit can say, but if I didn't create you with the disability, you would never have existed. The child without the disability is not a better version of you, it's a different child altogether. Okay? So, consider what I and others have called a miserable life. And sorry, all I mean life that is better than non-existence, but it's an awful life. Right? I mean, better on the whole than non-existence. Just better than non-existence. If the procreators can only choose between procreating a miserable life and not procreating, yeah? That's the standard 2 option choice. If that's their only choice, then the child they choose to create is not wrong, because had they not procreated, that child would not have existed. There's no better version of the child. Okay? You're not making anybody worse off, because had they not procreated, no child. And now, you'll see why the non-identity condition comes in. If you go for the 3 option choice, don't procreate, procreate now, procreate later, the choice between procreating now and later is not a choice between 2 versions of the same child, one better than the other. It's a choice between 2 different children. And again, you cannot make the child with the miserable life have a better life, because if you didn't create it, no child to be miserable or better off. Okay, and the rest of it is, I hope, straightforward. So that's why you need the non-identity puzzle, and why it really bugs people. Okay. So basically, I could deliberately create a child whose life I know is going to be miserable, but better than non-existence, just. And on the orthodox view, I do not wrong the child. Right? That's the puzzle. Okay. That's the worry. So now I have to tell you the bad news, which is there is a huge volume of writing on this puzzle. It just grows by the day. I mean, there are book-length treatments of it by philosophers saying, we've solved the puzzle, we've solved the problem. What is the puzzle? The puzzle seems to be straightforwardly that if I deliberately create a child whose life is miserable, I wrong that child, or at the very least I do something wrong. But it seems hard to explain why, given all that I've said. Okay. So let me just run through, in the time that remains, the responses, to give you a flavour of how people have responded. The first is a standard move in philosophy is say, bite the bullet, which is an English phrase meaning just go with it. This is a tough conclusion to come to, but we have no choice but to embrace this. The most recent book on the subject is actually defended bite the bullet. This is what philosophy tells us. You're just going to have to give up what you previously thought was your considered moral judgment. The problem is, most people think it's pretty obvious and straightforwardly true that if you deliberately create a child with a disability, you're doing something wrong to that child. So biting the bullet looks as if it takes us a long way away from our considered ordinary views. You can try to reject the non-identity condition, and you can actually try to say, actually, it's false, and you can offer a description of the two possible children I could create, the one now, the one later, and say they're actually the same child. Versions might be the child of Mr. and Mrs. Smith, or the child whose parents have the following genes. Okay? Parfit, I think, is going to say that won't do it, because what we know about the conditions of creating children is that there is clear non-identity between children of the same parents at different times. Okay? Every parent will tell you that their children are different, even though they are inheriting exactly the same set of genes from their parents. So that doesn't seem to work. This is Parfit's solution. Parfit says, if you create a child with, let's say, a disability, when you could choose to create a child without the disability by, let's say, waiting or taking some drugs, you act wrongly. But he says, in a kind of impersonal way, you don't do wrong to the child, you just act wrongly. You make the world worse off. You somehow increase the amount of disability in the world, and that's what makes your action wrong. But you don't do wrong to the child. I'm unhappy with that, because it seems to me that the wrongfulness of creating a disabled child precisely lies in what you do to this child. You can, this is John Harris's response and Jeff McMahon's response, you can construe harm non-comparatively. Remember, I said to harm somebody is to make them worse off. John Harris's response, Jeff McMahon's response is something like, I can harm somebody, but without making them worse off. That's deeply puzzling to me and many others. Bonnie Steinbock finds this very puzzling. She and I corresponded about what on earth it meant to harm someone if you didn't make them worse off. Here's a quick aside, which is very important in the argument. Because some of the examples, unfortunately, don't clearly separate issues. There is clearly a difference between harming somebody who already exists. So someone has been brought into existence and then we make them worse off. So the unfortunate example would be, let's say, blinding them. There's a difference between that and bringing into existence a person who is blind. So say you knew you were at high risk, you were a carrier of a condition, a genetic condition, such that a child had a chance of being born with severe visual impairment or blind. Okay. There seems to be a difference between bringing into existence somebody and making them worse off and creating somebody with that same disability. Secondly, as I've said, what seems to be very important here is that creating somebody, bringing somebody into existence is putting somebody without their agreement, without their consent, into this precarious state of existence. No child asks to be born, okay? And every protesting teenager at some point says to their parent, I never asked to be born. You know, when a parent says, look at everything I've done for you, how much I've helped you, and a teenager says, I never asked to be born, I got no choice, okay? It's not fair. The better version of this is, you are thrown into existence, you're put into the world without your say-so, without agreeing, without consenting, and this is a risky state to be in. Okay? There's no guarantee everything's going to work for you. It can be a vulnerable and risky state. If procreation is like that, then arguably you have real, serious duties as a prospective procreator. There are things you ought to do to try and minimize the risks that you expose someone to. And this is why I and others, and I'll give you a flavor of it, argue that the duties of a procreator, what they owe to the future child, is quite serious because of what you're risking when you go about procreating. This isn't a casual affair. Okay? You are creating another human being, all the risks that involves, and risks of very serious harms by bringing them into existence, so there are stringent duties. And this is expressed by saying there's something wrong with irresponsible procreation, with not procreating seriously, and that wrong is not well expressed in terms of harm. Okay? So some versions of it. Honora O'Neill was one of the earliest to defend the view that there's a duty of what she called responsible procreation. You are under a duty to ensure that your child is guaranteed what she said was a minimally decent life. Rahul Kumar has a piece, which I like a great deal, which says that the future child has a right to expect a certain kind of life. Right? It's as if the child, speaking when born, says, you brought me into existence, you created me. You have a duty to ensure that I'm guaranteed a certain kind of life. Or it's a view that I've defended in a piece called Wrongful Life, and Joel Feinberg, who I think is wonderful, has defended, and that is the idea of what we call a birthright. Okay? You have a birthright, a right to be born into a certain kind of life. Do people know the Frankenstein story? Yeah? I just got through from America a manuscript of a book which is arguing that you should read Frankenstein as a classic treatise of children's rights. And I actually am very sympathetic to that view because, and I've said so in print, What Dr. Frankenstein does wrong is create a monster who, if you've read the book, and the book is wonderful, don't go to see the films, just read Mary Shelley's book, which is absolutely fabulous. The monster is actually furious at being created. It says, you made me a monster, and you owe me the duties of a parent, because Frankenstein just abandons the monster, saying, I can't deal with you, you're terrible. And as you know, a plot spoiler, the monster takes revenge. Quite rightly, and says, look, you created me, you made me a monster, you didn't look after me, I will now take my revenge. And I won't tell you what the revenge is if you've not read. Okay. Now, that seems to me a wrongs account seems to me one way to go. But I'm just going to finish by showing you all the problems, which I don't think I've solved, and I don't think any of the other writers have solved. He looks still vulnerable to the non-identity problem, because if the child says, you know, Frankenstein's monster says, look, I didn't choose to be created, and look what you've created, this terrible life you've given me, the parent can turn around and say, if I hadn't done what I did, you wouldn't exist. Why can you complain? Had I not created you in this condition, there would be no you. So tough. Actually, Derek Parfit has a very nice footnote in his book where he quotes a letter to the English newspaper, The Times, in which someone precisely says, I have been wronged by my parents who brought me into existence with a disability. And Parfit says, the writer of the letter would not have been able to write the letter if he hadn't been in that condition.
So non-identity problem or non-existence problem? Because non-identity, I would...
Yeah. No, it's non-identity combined with non-identity. The thought is, you've created a terrible me, but you could have created a better me, a me without the disability or the... and the Parfit response is, yeah, but either you wouldn't have existed, in which case no complaint, or what would have happened is a child would have been created without that disability or that miserable life, but that would have been a different one. So, say Frankenstein had decided, Dr. Frankenstein had decided, look, it's a bit early to create the monster, I still haven't ironed out a few problems here, and I don't seem to be doing a very good job, and the body parts I've chosen aren't very good, I'll wait a year, and I'll create a new monster. That would be a different person. Second, you have this problem of arguing for a conclusion that gives you too much, because there are surely cases in which people, as it were, have no choice but to create a child whose life is not necessarily a good one. The kind of case I have in mind are, let's say, people who are in conditions of terrible poverty, and their poverty is not their fault, it's a result of injustice. Are we saying they can't have children? Because the only child they could create would be a child who will suffer the same poverty as they have. That, when I did a version of the paper early on, that was a standard response. People saying that's really unfair to say that people can't create, because through no fault of their own, the only child they can have is a child with a bad life. Thirdly, we do seem to want to talk about parental rights, the right to create, but that looks now in straightforward tension with the rights of a child not to be created. So the right to procreate, to have a child, is inconsistent with the right of a child not to be created, and it looks a puzzling one. And fourth is what you could call the threshold problem. For the John Harrises, Jeff McMahons of this world, it's very straightforward as to the kind of child you're allowed to create, a child whose life is better than non-existence. It's a low threshold, but as long as the child has a life better than non-existence, it's okay. For myself and Nora O'Neill and Kumar and others, what kind of life are we allowed to create? And if you read the literature, you'll find a lot of phrases like minimally decent. What's a minimally decent life? What does that mean? I try to argue in my piece it's a life in which a child enjoys most, if not all, of the basic human rights that we grant to everyone. But it's very hard to spell out the threshold. Okay, I'll finish there. Yes.
Two questions. One of them is saying, what if people argue that infertility is a kind of disease and would, yeah, I'm not like normal people in the government, they have the duty to treat people and the other question is, there is a case in the United States, a lesbian couple intentionally wanted to have a child, and I think there's another case in the United Kingdom as well.
Yeah.
Would you say the parents have wronged the child in that way?
No, excellent. Two excellent questions. Firstly, there are two ways you can argue for subsidized fertility treatment, for paying for fertility treatment, which follow from what you said. One is to argue that those who are infertile suffer from a condition that is not of their choosing and is their bad luck. And they are owed compensation for that condition. Justice demands that we provide them with some redress for that condition. And fertility treatment is a way of compensating. That's been argued rather nicely by a couple of people. The problem is that you cannot have children, that you are infertile, is not yet a disease. Okay. So there's something you can't do. Right? But there's lots of things that particular individuals may not be able to do as a result of their physical constitution. To count as a disease, it's got to be the case that in some important sense, your life is significantly worse off as a result. You know, that you are suffering. Okay? I can't sing. I'm tone deaf. Okay? I mean, don't ask me to sing a song because it's excruciatingly painful. Not for me, for anyone who listens. So there's something I can't do, sing in tune. But that's not a disease. Okay? It's only a disease if it makes sense to say that I suffer from something as a result of my inability. So infertility doesn't yet count as a disease. It's just something you can't do. To count as a disease, it's got to be associated with a degree of suffering. And here the criticism comes into play that experiencing it as suffering is only as a result of certain social pressures. The sort of Jennifer Aniston response, you make me feel bad about not having children, but that's because you put enormous social pressure on them. So it's then, again, not yet a disease. Another kind of response is to say, look, what is it you want to do? Do you want to have children? If so, adopt a child. Sally Haslanger, who's an American feminist philosopher, mainly writes in metaphysics, but she has written on adoption because she and her partner both have two adopted children, and actually they are white Americans and their two children are African American children. So she writes and speaks very interestingly about the problems of transracial adoption. Now, if Sally was in the room, she'd say, you want a child? There's thousands of children who need to be parented. So you haven't shown me that there's a right to be the biological parent of a child. All you've shown me is that there's a desire to act as a parent, as a guardian. And you can adopt children. Yeah? So those are the kinds of responses people might make to the claim that infertility is a disease and it's a condition we ought to treat by offering fertility treatment. Okay, you might want to respond to that. Second thing, the creation of children with deafness. Yeah, I'm going to say a little bit about it in the second thing, but I think the first response is this. The case you're referring to is famous insofar as it was a lesbian couple who were both deaf and who advertised for a sperm donor that would allow them to have a deaf child. And they were very open about it. It wasn't that it was discovered. And it created this storm of controversy. How could you do this? How could you? Well, part of the problem with deafness is many deaf members of the deaf community argue that deafness is not an obvious disability, that, for instance, it brings with it enormous compensating benefits. Okay? It's one of the senses that you can lose, but nevertheless gain as a result. And they also argued that deaf people form a community, and membership of that community is valuable. So they didn't see themselves as doing wrong in the sense of deliberately creating a child with a disability. So I think I've heard responses to that claim, and there are those who worry a great deal about what was claimed there. Let me say that on the HFEA, I chair the committee that licenses PGD, and PGD is pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, and it's the form of treatment that allows parents who are carriers of a genetic condition, or who may be suffering from the genetic condition, to have a child that doesn't inherit that genetic abnormality. And our committee licenses the conditions which are allowed. We're up to about 250 conditions that we've licensed in the UK. It's a huge number. But we only allow licensing for conditions that are serious. And we have to decide whether a condition is a serious one. I think our view would be deafness as such is not a serious enough condition to allow PGD. If it was associated with other problems, yes. It is certainly the case that in the United Kingdom, you're not allowed deliberately to select for a disability. So if a couple who had a genetic condition went to a fertility clinic and said, we want a child with our disability, the clinic would be guilty of crime if they provided fertility treatment. If that makes sense. Yeah? So much will depend, I think, on the nature of the disability that you are deliberately selecting for. And it's not always a clear and straightforward question of whether a disability is such that you do great wrong in creating a child with that difference. I mean, I'm trying to think, we had, I mentioned this in the conference. One of the cases we have is the condition of albinism, that is paleness of skin, and that this is a particularly problematic condition in the Afro-Caribbean community in England, where most members of the community have dark skin. Children with light skin as a result of albinism are stigmatized and suffer greatly. It's very, very difficult for them. So we thought in those terms it was a serious enough condition. But take height. Achondroplasia is a condition of dwarfism, of being short. But it comes in different variants. At what point is being short a disability? I mean, how short is seriously disabled? There are sections of the population in the United Kingdom who, for a variety of environmental reasons, are shorter than average. So if achondroplasia and dwarfism meant there was a risk of being born a male with a height of 5 foot, is that a disability? What's 5 foot in meters? 1.5, probably about 1.5 meters, yeah. So the question of what counts as a disability is a really, really tough one. And unfortunately, you're also into the very difficult area of criticism by disability groups who say you're wrong to criticize someone for bringing into existence a person with disability because you're saying that I shouldn't exist. But that is to disvalue me. So, but it's a tough question. Yeah.
Following on, in fact, there's a couple of things. One was the comment, because on this lady's question and the use of public funds. Because of course, Engelhardt using nature's lottery, actually argues that, in fact, a secular society owes no one the duty to correct some of the things. And it's not just a sort of, infertility, even things like terrible diseases, which every one of us thinks are diseases. So there's a limitation to that argument. But going back onto the disability rights and disvalue and that sort of thing is, knowing that and being well aware of the license of PGD by the HFEA, the problem is, you say, in a sense, you disagree with wrong being comparative, but you don't disagree with the fact that life with a disability can be, because wrongful life does actually depend somewhat on it, and can be better than non-existence.
Yep.
You're saying that a life with a disability is actually worse than non-existence.
No. No.
I just
No.
want you to
Yes, sure.
tease out that argument.
Yeah, no, sure. I think one thing that is helpful, and it's relevant to the second lecture in discussion of the argument by David Benatar, is once you come into existence, your life is going to be a mixture of good and bad. Okay, I mean, good things happen to you, bad things happen to you. But if you're able to look across your whole life, you might say, once you're born, once you're in existence, once you're enjoying both the pains and pleasures, there are reasons to carry on existing. And that could be in terms of the overall balance of good and bad that befalls you. But that's different from the question of whether you should even bring someone into existence in the first place. Okay. And there is a different balance of goods and bads. And I think I quoted someone, I really like it as an example. Joel Feinberg, who's a great hero of mine, says, in a very nice article, says, look, you want to know what it means to choose whether to bring somebody into existence, which seems puzzling. He says, imagine you believe in God. Right? Okay, so a God who's all-powerful and all-loving, and who makes decisions about creation. And God gives you a go at being him or her, and says, okay, just see how difficult my life is as God. I'm going to show you a life, a possible life. You tell me whether I should bring that person into existence. And God shows you, like a very fast film, this is what this person's life is going to be like. If I choose to create this person, this will be their life. Now tell me, should I bring that person into existence? All right? Does that make sense as a sort of imaginative exercise? So what do you have to say to yourself? What's the point at which you would say to God, no, don't create that person. Don't create that person. Wipe the slate clean. And what's the point at which you say, ooh, there are a lot of bad things in that life, but on the whole, on balance, go ahead and create the life. So the life worth living is thought to be the life that's better than never existing at all. It's just about worth coming into existence. There's enough in the possible life to outweigh all its harms. And it's not clear that disabilities, a life with disabilities, need be a life that you shouldn't bring into existence. Okay, that's the rough thought. I have to say that when we make PGD decisions, we're not saying that every disability that we are allowing PGD for is such that the life is not worth living. Though the reason I paused is we do get statements from the public. And I do remember a condition, I'm sorry, I can't remember what the condition was, but it was accompanied at the paperwork by a very moving statement by a parent who said, I have the condition. And I, on the whole, wish I'd not been brought into existence. It's so painful and so difficult. And I certainly don't want any child to have to go through what I went through. But that, fixing the point at which, the sort of baseline, the threshold at which you say, better never to bring into existence someone below that threshold, it's a very difficult one to fix. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
I think, I guess, you know that I'm from the family with disabilities, so it's just a story, not any comment or questions, but you know there is a podcast called Only Human by the National Public Radio. One of the latest podcast is the title is Growing Up Ugly.
Yes.
So there's a guy from Australia, he's really ugly. Because he was born with some deformed face,
Yeah.
and then some kind of genetic condition. Then throughout he growing up, he was being stigmatized, etc. A lot of surgery, but somehow the eyes are too wide, so they trying to kind of make more narrow. But he refused it because chance that you get blind. So what's the good about getting blind? Getting narrow eyes. In the end, he got married, divorced, another married, child. So now he's writing books about the children books about being ugly. So he's now teaching how the social value. Then the last question he got from the podcast that known to be the cause of his getting old deformed face about the mothers taking antidepressant on the person during the pregnancy.
Yeah.
So he was asked that what if would you regret that maybe your mom will not going to take it? It will be normal. But he say I don't know.
Yeah.
So I guess how come I know that was the case, but because I'm happy with as I are now. But I guess sometimes the disability is more complicated when you go to the individual case or the cultural context. I give my brother's example is okay because we are happy with it. Because my family has some genetic mutation cases. So only my second brother had a genetic mutation. So that disability disorder comes out about the puberty, about 15.
Yeah.
So so now then he got married, and then then it's getting worse and worse, and then it's like some kind of neuropsychiatric disorder, etc. So what happens is that my family, my parents, they feel really bad about my brother. So what happened is that they decided to give all their money to him. So my first brother, me, said, okay, it's okay. We don't get anything. We don't need it. Skip all. So what they did is that, so they think about how they're going to take care of my brother because they're going to pass away. They're going to live before that. So what they do is that they made the nursing home, private nursing home. So in the countryside. So that when they get really older, they can move to the nursing home. So they got some VIP penthouse over there, which is really nice. They got a really top floor. But then, my brother, he wanted to have a baby. Then this is a recessive disorder. The chance of getting about, a quarter. But then, my parents got really upset. But then he refused. So then he wanted to get a baby. But then if you do the PGD, he will know. Sometimes genetic, because they have a gene for the diabetic condition, but he refused to do it.
Yeah.
He doesn't want to know.
Yeah.
So then we ask him why you want to get it. Then people are saying that I need to have children to take care of me when I get older.
Yes. Yes.
Yes. So it's really hard. So sometimes when you go to disability cases, right?
I agree, and I think the comment at the end about genetic information is really, really interesting and important. There's quite a nice and influential piece by a philosopher, Mike Parker, which is arguing that genetic knowledge is not personal. So it's familial. So if you said, I don't want to know whether I have a given genetic condition, so I'd rather go through life not knowing whether I've inherited the genes. It's not really up to you alone, because it might be important for your children or for your brother or for others to know whether or not that mutation is running in the family, particularly since some genes run true, which means they tend to augment as it goes through generations. There are also disabilities that you'll never know Okay. One of the conditions we licensed was a serious dementia, which the sufferer, I remember asking the clinician, said, if you had this form of dementia, would you know? And the answer was no. When it came upon you, you wouldn't be aware that you had the condition. It would be the family who'd be very distressed by it. The other one that we always worried about are sudden heart failure. I mean, there are forms of cardiopathy which involve your heart just going, that's it, and you drop dead. There was a famous footballer who got it, just dropped in the middle of a football match. We always said, would you want to know you had that? Because once you know you've got it, you've got to avoid any kind of activity that would put you at risk. You've got to, as someone said, you could die running for a bus, you could die playing a game. If you were a child, would you want to know that you were continually at risk of sudden coronary failure? So there are interesting questions about inheritance patterns across families, and also the nature of the disability in terms of the person who has it and how bad it is for them to have that disability. And I'm going to say a little bit in the second lecture about who gets to choose whether or not you pass on a disability or not. Because clearly most people think it's for the parents to decide. It's their choice as to whether or not they pass on the disability. And in many cases, that's because they know what it's like. So you wouldn't, for instance, you wouldn't come for PGD in the UK unless you knew that it ran in your family. It's not the case that people turn up at clinics and say, I want a kind of genetic health test. I want a complete service to see whether or not I've got any mutation. You only come to apply for PGD because you're aware of a problem in the family. But interesting, I don't know, in part an answer to you, it's not compulsory to have PGD.
Right.
You know, which most people misunderstand, if you knew that you are a carrier of a particular mutation, you're not obligated to go and have PGD. You don't do anything, at least legally, wrong in having children who are at risk of inheriting the condition. All that PGD does is give you a choice that you might not wish to use, in part because PGD has lots of risks and is a very difficult process to go through. So Julian Savulescu is going to say you did wrong if you don't use PGD because you're risking a disabled child. But many families who know that they're at risk of mutation say, I'm going to run that risk. That's for us to decide. You can't compel me to go in for gene testing. Yeah.
No, yes, Mike. Thanks, Dave. Well, really interesting. I wanted to ask about the connection between this notion of the birthright, which you were referring to, and the idea of the non-comparative harm. Because you said it can't make much sense to the non-comparative harm. I was just wondering how the notion of the birthright, the violation of the birthright, would differ from that, since it would seem like this is a right which can only be, the only alternative to is non-existence. So it seems like what we have here is a harm, the violation of a right, where we've got no comparison. No sensible comparison.
Yeah. I think the two things to say. Firstly is that you can wrong somebody without harming them. Is the core intuition. So there's a very much quoted example by James Woodward in an early piece on the non-identity condition, and the example he uses is an African American goes to check in for a flight, and the counter clerk is racist and abuses him and refuses to issue him with a boarding pass. So he doesn't get to fly on the plane that actually crashes, killing all on board. So what the clerk does is actually to the benefit of the rejected passenger. He actually doesn't die. But most of us would say, well, he's still wronged, even if the action was not one that made him worse off. It saved his life. Okay. So if that example works, and you can think of other kinds of cases, you can wrong somebody and not make them worse off. All right. That's the first intuition. Okay. The other problem here is So the thought of Honora O'Neill is, or Kumar or myself, is that you wrong a child by creating them with a certain kind of condition. Okay? And that doesn't rely on the thought that you're worsening their condition. You're just violating their right to a certain kind of basic treatment. But the second issue is still going to be, but look, if the only alternative was non-existence, how does it make sense that you wronged them? I think the only way to respond to that is to say that you can directly wrong someone by creating them, by doing something to them, without appeal to the counterfactual, but in the absence of doing that wrong to them, they wouldn't have existed. By rejecting that construal. And one of the thoughts here is that creation of human beings is kind of sui generis. There's no other obvious analogy to what's to our normal ways of speaking morally. We're in the grip of a certain kind of theory that asks us to think of wronging and harming in certain kinds of ways. And when it comes to creating human beings, it's very difficult to make sense of it. So I think what those of us who like a rights-based or a wronging account are just going to appeal to is a fundamental thought. You wrong someone, not by making them worse off, but by violating, directly in creating them, violating their right to be born with certain expectations. I think it has, yeah, go on.
So I agree with you about the claim that it's sort of these cases are kind of sui generis, but I would urge you to consider biting the bullet, which I don't think is as bad as. Okay. So maybe we need an interpretation of the should here. We say to the mother that she should wait, where we don't try to locate it in some kind of harm that's done or some kind of right that's violated of the individual that's created. But that we don't retreat from that to the Parfitian, let's just maximize utility over possible worlds or whatever. Like there might be a prudential should here. It will be a lot more work for you. Or there might be a should relating to society. It'll be a lot more difficult for society.
I think you might be being slightly unfair to Parfit and others, because the thought is, the thought of non-person affecting wrongness, the famous theory that Parfit never developed in Reasons and Persons is the woman who refuses to delay having the child when it could be done at very little cost to her, and thus has a child with a serious disability when, had she waited, the child, she would have had a child without disability. Parfit takes it as uncontentious that she does wrong in not delaying. He thinks that's uncontroversial. But what he thinks you can't say is that she did wrong to the child. That's the thought. So you, as it were, you disengage wrongfulness from wronging. That seems to me a plausible move to say. There are wrongful actions that don't consist in wronging somebody. All right? Now, so you've got wrongfulness, wronging someone, and harming someone. Okay, so I want to disengage wronging someone from harming someone. Parfit wants to disengage wrongfulness from wronging someone. So he thinks the woman acts wrongfully, but doesn't wrong the child.
Morally wrong? Like
He thinks the action is clearly morally wrongful. But
it's not morally wrong. She doesn't act morally wrongly.
Oh, okay. Unless she wrongs somebody. Yeah. So what you're rejecting is Parfit's claim that there's another account of moral wrongfulness that is non-person affecting. Yeah. Okay. I'm sympathetic to that because my intuition is that when the child is born with a disability, I can understand the child saying, "You did wrong to me in creating me with this disability." And of course, the reply by Parfitians is, no, you can't say that. You see, had you not created me, there wouldn't be a person to complain about. Yeah, that's the thought. That's why Feinberg, O'Neill, Kumar, and me to a certain extent moved to There's still a sense of wronging, but it doesn't require the comparison, the comparative harm. I mean, John Harris tries a version of it by saying you can make sense of putting into a harmed condition, but not harm someone. And I can't make sense of harm unless it's comparative, okay? Because without a comparative baseline, it's hard to see what it is to make someone worse off, which is essentially what harm is about. So I think, as I say, I think the routes you go are bite the bullet, which some people do go. I mean, the most recent book just goes that way and says, well, so much the worse for our ordinary intuitions. And I think one thought I didn't really spend time exploring further is the relationship between moral theory and ordinary common sense morality. So what you mean by bite the bullet is say, get rid of ordinary common sense morality. It's just got it wrong here. Okay. Moral theory tells us what is wrong. Common sense morality has another view. There's a great book of metaphysics by Peter Strawson called Individuals, which is a wonderful book. And in the preface, Peter Strawson says there are two kinds of metaphysics. And he calls them ordinary and revisionary. And he says revisionary metaphysics is about changing the way we currently think about the world. And he says, I'm not a revisionist. My metaphysics stays closely tied to how we actually commonsensically, ordinarily think about the world. And I think there's two views of moral theory. One is moral theory stays very close to ordinary common sense ways of judging. Sidgwick in the 19th century, Mill, Strawson himself, Hare, a whole tradition of moral theorists who saw themselves as based in ordinary common sense views. The other tradition is revisionist, and Parfit is the great example. Parfit says we have to revise the ways we think about what's right and wrong. So when our view is that we wrong the child who we create, so much the worse for our judgment. Get rid of it, revise it, jump it. I just think that's a huge cost. But yeah.
Let's talk about the Zika virus case. Because let's say the chance of getting disability is a chance.
Yeah.
It's okay, but now it's not really a chance we can really control for it.
Yeah.
And then after you go on call to people, then 10% got Zika, 9% don't.
Yeah.
I wish I'm not here.
Yeah. When we license PGD, we have to satisfy ourselves of two tests. One is that the risk of passing on the condition is significant, and the other is that the condition is a serious one. So we take significance of risk to be about penetrance. So you can inherit a genetic mutation, but it never shows itself, okay, or shows itself in very small form. Now, most genetic mutations have something around, tend to have high penetrance, but there are increasingly genetic conditions where actually the risk of getting the associated condition are quite low. Mitochondrial is going to be one of these cases where, in fact, you might get probabilities somewhere around 15%. That even if you pass on the defective mitochondria, it's only about 1 in 6 or 7 that a child will display any symptoms. Is that risky enough? And there are very difficult questions about estimating and evaluating risks. I think that kind of problem and what you're raising is fascinating in terms of the David Velleman view that somehow it's risky to bring human beings into existence. You know, I mean, existence is a parlous, difficult, risky state. You should only do it cautiously. But one says, well, how cautious have you got to be? Yeah. And I don't think that has an obvious answer. I really don't. On.
I have two question or comment. I mean, the first one is very short. It's about the airplane example that you mentioned. I mean, it struck me that that is similar to the one that you mentioned last time, in that the harm involves a potential harm or counterfactual harm. And my second question, the longer question, is this. I'm trying to create an example in which someone has done something wrongfully without harming someone. But this is by no means an analogy, a perfect analogy to, I mean, suppose there's a house on fire.
Yep.
And I'm under no obligation to go in to save anyone because that would pose a substantial risk to my own life.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know people there, right? But suppose, having thought about it, I decided to rush in.
Mm-hmm.
And so I haven't taken the risk, and I rush in, and instead of saving someone who's unconscious or harm, I took something else. I saved a piece of furniture. Is that or a dog? And that seems to me to be clearly wrong. But have I harmed this guy? And well, unless we say that not saving him is harming him.
Yeah.
But we could also have another example. Suppose there's 5 people here, and 1 person here, and in order to save either group, but not both, right? Because they're in the opposite direction. I would pose substantial risk to myself, or it would take a long time. But let's say I decided to do the risk. I mean, to undertake the cost. But upon arrival, instead of saving this 5 strangers, I saved this one. And that seems to be wrong. I think most people would say that's wrong. Even though have I harmed this guy? Unless we say not harming him. Not saving him is harming him. But I think that we might be hesitant to say that not saving these guys are harming him because to begin with, I was under no obligation. And I have many alternatives to attend to.
Actually, one of the other issues that's lurking here is making worse off than what? And in the background is a normative assumption, making worse off than he or she ought to have been. But there are straightforward non-normative senses of worsening someone's condition, which just mean, in the absence of my action, the possibly wrongful action, in the absence of my doing that thing, are they, as a matter of fact, worse off? So the airline clerk example is supposed to be one where, had he not been racist and had he not abused and issued the boarding pass, then the passenger would have died. So in the absence of his racist action, the person is actually better off. And there are many more straightforward examples. I mean, imagine that I deliberately and intentionally, for bad reasons, punch you, but unbeknownst to me, you actually suffer from a bizarre medical condition, which means that my punch dislodges a blood clot, which otherwise would have killed you. So clearly my punching of you cures you, but it looks obvious that what I've done is wrong. So I just seem to be so many straightforward cases where you act wrongly and wrong someone, but you don't make them worse off. But I think one thing is that the failure to provide people with a benefit is controversially a harm. I think so. Not benefiting someone, not making someone better off, is controversially described as a harm or a worsening, because you then have to introduce normative presences. I ought to do this thing for you, and my failure to do it actually worsens the condition you have a right to expect. And that's an important debate as well. Yeah. Should we? Yeah.
Okay, let's thank
Okay, so what I wanted to do as the second lecture was look at some puzzles about possible limits to procreative choice and circumstances under which you shouldn't have children, but also questions of whether you can choose the types of children that you have. I'm just going to start with a very brief summary of a book by David Benatar, which I really recommend. There is a shorter version of this as an article. And I should say David is a friend, and we edited a book together. I think he's an excellent philosopher, but this is a claim he makes that most people think is so obviously, outrageously wrong that it's a case of philosophy being led in the wrong direction by his argument. Basically, David thinks it would be much better if none of us had ever been born. Okay. Now, he argues it through, I'll just give you the three premises, because if they're true, he's right. The first is something that's called an asymmetry. It's something that Jeff McMahon first identified, and it's basically that it seems wrong to create miserable lives. That just seems wrong, okay? Basic intuition that it would be wrong to bring into existence people whose lives are bad. Most of us think that's true. But we don't think that we're under an obligation to create happy lives. By which I mean, we should not bring into existence people whose lives are miserable, but it doesn't follow on the other side that we are obliged to bring into existence people whose lives are happy. This is sometimes expressed as we should make people happy, but we shouldn't make happy people. Okay, once people exist, you should make them happy, but there's no obligation to go about creating people whose lives will be happy. For a pretty obvious reason, because then we'd spend all our time procreating. And if that's what we ought to do, we ought to bring lots and lots of people into existence, because it will increase the amount of happiness. Now, what David says is, it follows from that, is that the absence of good lives doesn't count in favor of procreation. It's not an argument for procreation that we could make happy people and make people who will have benefits. But the presence of harms is a reason not to procreate. All right? So you've got a reason not to procreate, namely that you are causing or risking harms, but you don't have a reason on the other side from the possible benefits, because they don't count in favor of procreation. Secondly, and this is very important to David's argument, you need to make a distinction between the arguments for and against carrying on existence. Once you're in existence, there are reasons to carry on, to continue, but it's entirely different where we're contemplating whether or not to bring into existence someone, to start lives. So the reasons for and against staying alive are different from the reasons for and against beginning to exist. And thirdly, he says there's a lot of evidence that our lives are actually miserable. Actually, David has some lovely, lovely examples in the book, which I suggest you read. But we're incurable optimists. Human beings tend to forget bad things. We tend to discount all the pains we suffer, and we only think about the good things in our life. But actually, we've got it wrong most of the time. Okay, so he thinks all those three reasons taken together give you a very powerful reason not to bring in anybody into existence. And on the whole, it would be better if none of us had ever been brought into existence. Once in existence, sure, we have reasons to carry on, but if we'd had a choice, better never to have existed. To those who know their history, this is an argument that's found in Schopenhauer, who thought life is miserable and actually terrible. Human existence is miserable, okay? And if we had the choice, we shouldn't have been created. So David's creating a new version of this. Now, I should be very clear, because David gets very upset about being misunderstood. And I know this from having edited with him. And he's been subject to a whole lot of attacks that he thinks are misdirected. He's not suggesting that you now go about murdering everyone. Okay, he's not suggesting either that you sterilize people, that you prevent people from procreating. But he said, if by accident or chance we became infertile, and humans slowly cease to exist, that would not be a bad thing if we disappeared off the face of the earth. Now, the standard reply to David is to say that the asymmetry he appeals to isn't justified. And why couldn't you say that the absence of good things and benefits counts in favor of procreation as much as harms? And if that's the case, you would just do a straight balancing, a sort of accounting of the harms and benefits of existence. In reply, a lot of people are going to insist this asymmetry is so well entrenched, it's such a powerful intuition we have, that you shouldn't create miserable lives, but you're not obliged to create good lives. That's such a powerful intuition that once you grant it, the rest of his argument seems to follow. Okay. All right, I just wanted to introduce you to Benatar because it's fun, and there's a lot more that could be said. I'm going to look at something I hope is a bit more accessible and something that is real-life problems and puzzles. And these are ones that I face in my job outside university sitting on the HFEA. And the first is what are known as saviour siblings. And saviour siblings are children who are deliberately created in order to supply life-saving tissue for an existing child with a particular condition. All right? So what you have to imagine is that you are the parents of a child with a very serious, life-limiting, life-threatening condition, and the only way the child can be cured is by compatible tissue. And what often happens is that parents will have themselves tested to see if they can be donors of the tissue. They can go on a waiting list to see if there are compatible donors somewhere else in the world. But as a last resort, they might deliberately create a child in order to have the tissue to save their existing child. And these are called saviour siblings, and they're deeply controversial. So I thought it would be nice to give you a sense of the real-life debates there have been in the UK about this. You create saviour siblings by fertility treatment, PGD, and HLA, or HLA tissue typing. And just to explain each, and correct me if I get it wrong, fertility treatment is going to involve the creation of surplus embryos, more embryos than you can put back, okay? That's what you do. PGD, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, is then testing the embryos that you've created to ensure whether they have a genetic condition or whether they have compatibility. And HLA is tissue typing to make sure that the embryo is going to provide you with compatible tissue for an existing sibling. Okay, so what you're going to do is deliberately create a child through creating a number of embryos and then testing them to test PGD and HLA. And once you have an embryo that does not have the condition and also is compatible with your existing child, that's the one you put back. Right, you implant and hopefully have a normal pregnancy. Okay. These procedures, I have to say, are very rare in the UK. I think we only have about 3 a year at much, 2 or 3 a year. But they have caused a great deal of controversy. The constraints on doing it are that the condition of the affected child should be severe or life-threatening. It can't be a trivial condition. It has to be a very serious one, and it has to be such that you would be justified in using PGD. Oops. It has to be the case that all other possible treatments and sources of tissue have been exhausted, have been tried, and none is found suitable. And there are very strict limits on the tissue you can use from the child you create, the saviour sibling. The use of umbilical stem cells is permitted, but you're not normally allowed to use other tissues such as spinal stem cells or even organs. I'm trying to remember, there's a famous book which philosophers always quote by the American author Judy Picoult, which was made into a film, which is actually real life, it's a dramatization of a saviour sibling. It's really nicely put. It's a nice little book, and the film's awful. But it tries to what it would be like to be the child. It tries to imagine what it would be like to be the child that is then going to be used. And actually, in the book, there's an escalation in the tissue that's used because each attempt to use certain tissue fails. But in the UK, you can't, for instance, do spinal taps. You can use umbilical, and that's it. Okay. Now let me give you two cases that led to a debate in the literature, bioethical literature. And interesting, because some of the discussion of it used the non-identity problem. The first was Whittaker. And this was a case in which the HFEA, before I was a member, by the way, so I have nothing to do with these cases. Don't blame me. Just as I joined, the HFEA refused to allow the creation of a Sabius sibling. And that was upheld after what's called judicial review. JR is a particular move you can make in the UK whereby you can challenge essentially a public body. And you can, as an individual, go to court and ask for a review by the court of the decision that the public body has made. So the Whittaker was the family concerned, and they took the HFEA to court after it refused the creation of a saviour sibling. And they wanted to allow the creation of a saviour sibling to save the life of their existing child, Charlie, who suffered from diamond blackfan anemia, a very rare blood disorder, which meant he needed blood transfusions every 3 weeks. His only chance of living beyond early adulthood was a bone marrow transplant from a compatible donor. The second case is called Hashmi, 2 years later. And here there was a 3-year-old, Zain Hashmi, who suffered from a particular blood disorder, beta thalassemia, and he had to undergo regular blood transfusions and might die without a bone marrow transplant. Beta thalassemia is hereditary, and both of the Hashmis were asymptomatic carriers, meaning they didn't themselves suffer from the condition, but they had the genetic mutation. And that meant that any child they produced carried a 1 in 4 chance of inheriting beta thalassemia. Mrs. Hashmi initially conceived naturally in the hope that she might be able to create a match for him, for Zain. The resulting child, though free of the disease, was not a tissue match. His parents then launched a worldwide search for a donor, and when that failed, they began to consider alternative options. Okay, so you've got the two cases, very interestingly closely related in terms of the effects for the two children. Okay. In that case, the HFEA said they could create a saviour sibling. Okay, so they refused it in the case of Whittaker, and they allowed it in the case of Hashmi. Hans shaking his head. Okay, why? Why did they do that? Okay. The difference was seen to be that in the case of Whittaker, as opposed to Hashmi, there was no chance that the child would inherit the same genetic condition as the existing sibling. In other words, in the case of Hashmi, beta thalassemia is an inherited genetic condition. So any child that they had might have the same condition as the sibling. But that wasn't true of Whittaker. It wasn't a genetic condition that might be passed on. It was thus argued that in the first case in Whittaker, the family was only using PGD to create a saviour sibling. Right? They weren't using PGD to avoid a child having the same condition. They were only creating a child to provide tissue. Whereas in Hashmi, they could do both. They could create a child who wouldn't have the inherited condition, but also could supply compatible tissue. And I have to say, I joined the HFEA when Susie was the chair, wonderful chair. And Susie was very, very opposed to, she thought the decision was right, okay, to disallow it in Whittaker and allow it in Hashmi. And here's a nice quote from her. If the embryo to be biopsied is not at risk of a serious genetic disease, if you're doing PGD simply in order to benefit another person, is it acceptable that a child should bear these unquantified risks in order to make it possible to save the life of its sibling. Is this a just imposition of risk? So Susie Leather's view was, in Hashmi, it was okay because there you were using PGD to ensure that the child didn't have the same condition as its sibling. In Whittaker, all you were doing was creating a child to save the life of an existing sibling. And she thought, and others on the HFEA thought, that was wrong and unacceptable. That distinction was widely challenged in the literature as outrageous. Okay? And at the time, the HFEA added this condition to justify. The embryos conceived in the course of this treatment should themselves be at risk from the condition by which the existing child is affected. And that would then justify the distinction between Whittaker and Hashmi. That's what they argued. The HFEA has since changed its rules. Nothing to do with me, by the way. I wasn't party to the change of mind. But I think generally it's right. So the HFEA subsequently was persuaded it got it wrong, and it now allows for the creation of a saviour sibling who is not him or herself at risk of the condition. Does that distinction between Whittaker and Hashmi make sense? So, yeah? In one, there's no risk that the child is going to inherit the condition, and you're only creating the child to provide compatible tissue. In the Hashmi case, you're doing two things. You're creating a child free of the condition who can also supply tissue. And now the HFEA says you can allow for the creation of saviour siblings, children whose only function is to supply tissue. But that is still subject to standard criticisms. And a number of people think it's wrong to create saviour siblings. It's morally wrong deliberately to bring into existence children whose function is to save the life of an existing child. Why? Well, the general objection to the creation of saviour siblings is that it's wrong to have an instrumental reason for creating a child. This is, those of us who know their philosophy will see what's coming, that you are using the child as a means to the saving of another's life. And you're therefore not respecting the child as an end in himself or herself. And here's a good example from Richard Nicholson. We are not treating this saviour sibling as a human being of equal worth to other humans. We are not creating this saviour sibling to be a child in its own right. We have created it, designed it, to be a source of spare parts for an existing child. If you start designing other human beings, you are putting them on a lower level than yourself. I think that's a very nice, powerful, punchy way of summarizing a worry that many people commonsensically have. You're just using the child as an instrument, a machine, a means to save an existing child. And as you will all recognize, this is a nice, popular version of Kant. And Kant demands that we not treat people as means, that we regard human beings as ends. As Kantians will immediately insist, we treat their humanity as an end, which is to say their reason. However, what people immediately say is Kant didn't say never treat people as means, but always treat them as an end. What he in fact said was never treat people solely as a means. Never treat people exclusively, entirely as means. And why not say that parents who create saviour siblings are not in fact creating children only, solely, exclusively to save the life of their existing child. They're also creating a child that they will love. when Whittaker and Hashmi wanted to create saviour siblings, they were not, as it were, creating a child that they would only regard as a source, as Nicholson said, of spare parts. They were creating a child they would love. But they were also creating a child who could save the life of their existing child. And what's wrong with that? That doesn't violate Kant's dictum. Moreover, if we go down this route, we're going to be in trouble because many parents have children for very dubious instrumental reasons. So this is a quote from my own book. To prove it can be done to spite or blackmail another adult, to bring about a life that avoids the errors of its begetter, to try to save a disastrous relationship, to create a companion and assistant for one's dotage, a child to look after you when you're old, to add another soldier to the arm of the motherland or another true believer to the ranks of the faithful, and so on. Lots of bad reasons people have children, which are entirely instrumental to serve our existing purposes. So if we're going to start ruling out having children for instrumental reasons, there's an awful lot of children who should never ever be created, and lots of people who should never ever be parents. There are other objections to saviour siblings which it's worth considering. The most prominent is this, that the child will grow up knowing that it had been created for this particular function, and this knowledge would be psychologically damaging. The thought here is the saviour sibling will come to think, I've only been created, I've only been brought into existence to save my brother or sister. And that would be a very damaging psychological revelation. However, all the evidence that we have, and it's small amounts of evidence, of saviour siblings, is that no child who's acted as a saviour sibling has ever reported deep unhappiness at the conditions of their own existence. And why not also argue from the other side that one of the most moving things you could be told is, you're the reason your sister is alive. You're the reason your brother didn't die. You had it in you as a child to save another life. Isn't that wonderful? Why wouldn't a child feel there's no better reason to exist than to be the reason a continuation of your sibling's life? However, it may still be said that allowing the creation of a child, because of certain genetic properties it has, is at the top of a slippery slope. That if we allow these kinds of choices, procreative choices, are we not risking a slide down a slope to something deeply unacceptable? And what we worry about is eugenics. Okay, so I thought that it would be useful to say something about eugenics as a way of highlighting the concerns many people have about making certain genetic choices. I should say at the start that when we license PGD in the UK, the fact that we have to satisfy ourselves of a particular statutory test, namely significance of risk and seriousness of the condition, is because when the United Kingdom Parliament made it possible to license PGD, very real concerns were expressed in Parliament. That if limits were not put on PGD, you were heading towards designer babies. If we allow genetic selection in the case of serious conditions, won't we move inevitably towards allowing for the creation of ever more perfect babies, and won't that bring with it all the risks that have been identified in the past as eugenics? You probably know that eugenics simply means good genes. That's all it means. But the history of eugenics is unavoidably influenced by the experience of the Second World War. and the practices of the Nazis. And I have to say, by some discreditable practices in the post-war period, both in America and in Scandinavia. Don't think that bad eugenics has only been practiced by the Nazis. It's been practiced elsewhere. There have been cases in America of systematic eugenic controls on the transmission of what were perceived as unacceptable traits across generations. There's a very famous judgment in the US Supreme Court which involved the involuntary sterilization of a woman who was seen as exhibiting the same pattern of mental disability as her mother and her grandmother. And Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was one of the great US Supreme Court judges, supported the sterilization of this particular woman with one of the more infamous judgments saying 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. So I just want to make it clear that it's not just the Nazis who've justified making bad eugenic choices. The Americans have. And Sweden, great, otherwise enlightened social democratic country, has practiced eugenics in the post-war period. I visited a university in northern Sweden, Umeå, and my host there took me to what used to be the mental hospital in Umeå, which is now an art gallery, and said, nobody talks about it, but eugenics was practiced in this very building. Selective, compulsory sterilization of patients to avoid the transmission of unacceptable mental traits. Now, because eugenics has such a bad history, it's very hard to justify it. But I wanted to introduce you to one influential argument by the American philosopher Nicholas Agar. And Nicholas Agar argues that there is a kind of good version of eugenics, which is liberal, and he contrasts it with bad eugenics. So liberal eugenics is where you simply leave the choices to parents. You allow parents to make choices for their own children, and on the basis of their own understanding of what might be a good life. And that allows them to enhance the traits of any children they might have, and you intervene before they're born. So this is involving PGD, and it's not post-birth interventions. And if you're only avoiding the transmission of abnormalities or imperfections, these should be based on clear, well-proven scientific understandings. This is to be contrasted, he said, with authoritarian eugenics of the kind that was practiced by the Nazis and by the Americans. There, you give responsibility for making eugenic choices to the state, not to parents. You do so on the basis of a single understanding of what a good life comprises, and your means are by, in the case of the Nazis, the elimination of those persons you think are imperfect or defective, and that may well involve murder. Your notions of what counts as a better life are unproven, scientifically dubious, and ideological. So there's a very stark contrast for Agar between, as it were, liberal eugenics that allows parents to make certain kinds of choices and those which are bad, which is where you give the state the right to make those choices. Now, Agar has a very nice, simple, elegant argument. This is liberal eugenics is the right of parents because all it involves is allowing them to choose whether to procreate and then combining that with the equivalence of eugenic choices and rearing child once they're born. So let me just go through this. First of all, you say the right to have children, to choose how many and when to have children, is an essential element of personal autonomy. If people can lead the lives they choose, they should be allowed to choose whether or not to have children. Parity of parental rearing is as follows. If we allow parents to produce certain traits by modifying their children's environment, then surely they should also be permitted to make those same traits, produce those same traits by genetic modification. Right? So we don't think it's problematic to allow parents to make choices about how to bring up their children, how to educate them, what environments to place them in, with a view to them acquiring certain traits. So parents might want their children to be good at music. They would then expose them to a certain kind of environment. They would pay for certain kinds of education and training and nurture. We don't have any problem with that. But if you could do that through genetic modification, what would be the difference? Allowing parents to choose their children and conceding that genetic modification is no morally different from the use of environmental situations to change children gives you the following conclusion. Parents should be allowed to use available techniques of genetic enhancement just as they're allowed to modify a child's environment, be it educational, religious, cultural, recreational. Okay? So it's a very nice, I'm not endorsing it, I think it's actually a mistaken argument, but it's a very, very nice way of trying to defend one version of eugenics against some standard worries. Saying, all we're saying here is adults can choose when to have children, so why shouldn't they choose the kinds of children they have? They choose the kinds of children that grow up. Why can't they, before they're even born, choose the kinds of children they'll have? What's wrong with that? And remember, this is a permissive argument. It's not arguing that parents are obligated to produce better children. It's saying if they choose, they should be allowed to do so. The standard objections, I'm going to run through these. Those who know the literature, these are all very familiar. The first is a problem of aggregation of individual choices. There are standard puzzles that it might seem okay at the individual level to allow parents to choose the kinds of children they want, but if every adult is allowed to do this, taken in total and added up or aggregated, there may be bad side effects or consequences. So it's a familiar problem that in a lot of cultures, adults want male children. And they don't want girls. If you allow each and every set of parents to choose whether or not to have a male or female child, and you can use sex selection, then you're going to end up long-term with a huge disproportion of genders. Okay? Sex selection for non-medical reasons is illegal in the United Kingdom. You're not allowed to do it. But a lot of adult prospective parents in the UK know that you can sex select in other countries. India is a classic case. So in fact, some UK parents go to have IVF in India to ensure they have a male child. And there was a challenge to the HFEA, a judicial review on sex selection, which came from a couple who, I think I'll get it the right way around, had had 4 boys and wanted a 5th child to be female, quote, to complete the family. And they challenged the HFEA as to why they shouldn't be allowed to use sex selection for non-medical reasons. They lost the judicial review. And I have to say the UK Parliament is very unsympathetic to the principle of sex selection. And we have to tread very, very carefully when we license PGD for what are called X-linked conditions, which are conditions that only boys suffer from. There's also 2 further challenges to Agar's claim. The first is one of justice. IVF and PGD is very expensive, right? And if you want it to be successful, you almost certainly will have at some stage to pay for cycles of treatment beyond what is free. And that would have implications for fairness insofar as only those who are already well off will have the economic means to make these kinds of genetic choices. And thus allowing liberal eugenics, allowing parents to make genetic choices, will have the effect that the rich will be able to make their children better, even better. So it's a standard objection to private education, is that this allows the well-off to ensure that their children gain even further advantages from the kind of upbringing they can pay for. And if you allow parents to pay for genetic enhancement, you will further exacerbate the gap between rich and poor. Now, there's ways you might move against this. You might say everybody gets a voucher. All right? You know, everybody gets one go at genetic enhancement and PGD, irrespective of income. But it's not clear that will entirely solve the problem. And the third challenge is that it's a standard objection to any form of genetic modification, either elimination of disability or enhancement, that in effect it stigmatizes those already in existence who suffer from a disability. So when we license a condition in the UK, we advertise in advance that we're going to consider an application for PGD, and we invite public comment. And we do get public comments from disability groups. Okay? They vary. Given your earlier question, interestingly, the deaf lobby is the most vocally opposed to certain kinds of genetic choices, whereas the visually impaired and blind are the most sympathetic. And it's not clear to me entirely why that's the case. But when we have considered conditions that involve serious visual impairment, the major organization in the UK, Royal National Institute for the Blind, always writes to us saying, yeah, go ahead. That's not a nice condition. We wouldn't want anyone to have it. They don't seem to be worried by what is often called the expressive objection, that in making prenatal choices not to bring into existence somebody with a disability, you are stigmatizing those who already exist with a disability by effectively saying, it would be better if you were dead. Those in the blind or visually impaired lobby don't worry. Those in the deaf or orally impaired do worry about it. It's quite interesting to me that that's the case. Okay. Why should we allow parents to choose? Why should we think this is a matter for adults as to whether they have a child with a disability or not? Well, there are a number of reasons which I think are very powerful. Firstly, parents are the primary carers. They will have to, as it were, endure or suffer the burdens of caring for a child with any particular disability. And it seems reasonable to allow them the choice to avoid having a child, which will impose very significant burdens on them if they have to look after them. It's also the case that parents and members of the extended family may well and often probably will have direct experience of the disability. Okay? To repeat, you don't go for PGD in the UK randomly. You go because you know it runs in the family. Because you have some experience, either yourself or a close relative has suffered from the disability, and you want to avoid passing it on to your own children. However, it seems fair to say that there is a legitimate public interest in regulating the exercise of parental choices. And it seems to me largely because of those two worries that I've already rehearsed. One is that you might have unintended aggregated consequences of allowing individuals to make various decisions. And also issues of justice, ensuring fair access to genetic decision-making. The last issue I wanted to raise with you is a very interesting one, and I think was touched on by some of the questions at the end of the first lecture, which have to do with genetic testing once you're born. So up to now we've been dealing with making choices before, antenatally, that is testing embryos and then making decisions about what embryos you put back. But there's also the question of testing children once they're born to see if they have the condition that the parents may know they carry. Okay? Does that make sense? Now, there are some philosophers who believe that this violates a child's right to an open future. And just to explain where this comes from, Joel Feinberg, my hero, wrote a very influential article. And he was responding to a US Supreme Court decision called Yoder versus Wisconsin. And Yoder versus Wisconsin was a case brought by Yoder against the state of Wisconsin. And Yoder was Amish. And the Amish community are a very particular religious community in the United States, mainly found in states like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. Very strict and austere. They are a religious community that don't believe in any music, no electricity, no motor cars, and no reading apart from the Bible. Okay? You would probably know them from films or seeing pictures because they wear very simple black and white clothes, no adornments, and they use horse-driven buggies. They won't use mechanical. So I went once to the APA Eastern in Philadelphia and spent the day going out to see a Pennsylvanian Amish community. And it was astonishing to see them riding around. Why the court case? Because at that time, Wisconsin state had a minimum school leaving age. In other words, children had to stay in school up to a certain age, which was 16. The Amish said, we should be exempt. We shouldn't be subject to that rule, because if our children stay in school to the age of 16, that will threaten their identity and membership of the community and mean the eventual end of the Amish life. We want our children to be allowed to leave school earlier than everyone else. They won. Okay, Yoder won against the state of Wisconsin, and it really alarmed a lot of liberals, American liberals, of whom Feinberg was one. And Feinberg criticized the decision, saying, what it did was jeopardize the right of every child to an open future. And by that he meant the right of a child to make its own choices when it grew up. Keeping the child in school to a certain age ensured that the child would grow up to be an adult able to make his or her own choices. And he characterized that as the right to an open future, a future which was open to them to choose rather than closed by being kept within the Amish community. Okay? But that right has been used by bioethicists to argue against both genetic selection and genetic testing. Okay? That what it does is deny the child the right to make its own choices. So Dina Davis has this. The primary arguments against deliberately seeking to produce deaf children is it violates a child's own autonomy and narrows the scope of her choices when she grows up. In other words, what you're doing is closing off the choices that a child might make. Now, it's not clear that foreclosing certain choices is harmful to the future child. Why? I mean, merely limiting choices. Why is that a harm? In terms of testing, and this is a standard move, testing in childhood removes the possibility of that individual making an autonomous decision as an adult. So the thought is, if the parents go and get the child tested to see whether it has the genetic condition, you're denying the child the opportunity when it grows up to choose for itself whether to be tested. You're looking very puzzled by that. This is appealing to Feinberg, saying you're just stopping, you're closing off one choice that the child might want to make when they're older. Standardly, in bioethics, there is a view that adults have a right not to know certain things. Right? The right to refuse being provided with a diagnosis or the disclosure of a condition. So if you test the child will always know whether it's got that condition or not. And maybe you don't want to know. And it would be for the child, when it grows up, to say, okay, now I'll choose whether or not I get tested. So there is a real worry about testing a child for a genetic condition. My response to that, and it's a response others have made, is as follows. Firstly, genuinely free, autonomous choices, informed choices, can only be made if you know certain things. And surely, as the child grows into adulthood, it ought to have as much information as possible in order to make the right kinds of choices. It sounds odd to say that you deny knowledge to someone to maximize autonomy. Secondly, we often preempt later choices, deny later choices in many, many matters. Feinberg's piece is very influential, but most argue that it's hopelessly wrong because he defines it as maximizing the number of choices a child can make when they're an adult. But how's that possible? If you're a musically gifted child, let's say, the only way you can, at least in the West, have a successful musical career is by making a decision very early on to subject the child to an intensive musical education. All right? If you do that, you'll certainly allow the child, when it's an adult, to be a successful musician, but you will have denied that child the choice of any other career. Or, take another example. Children who exhibit prowess and skill in some particular sport often undergo the most intensive education from about the age of 11, 12. There are football academies associated with all the major clubs in the West that take children as young as 12, 13, and 14 in order to train them to become good footballers. But if they're trained to be good footballers, they certainly can't be good musicians. So it doesn't make much sense to argue that you can genuinely maximize choice. And indeed, Feinberg thinks that you have to strike a very difficult balance between ensuring choice as an adult and realizing what you think are the innate capacities of any particular child and developing what looks like their inherited talents. So it's not clear that we should, as parents, deliberately not make choices in order to leave the child as free as possible. You have to make choices for the child in order to allow it to lead certain kinds of lives. And testing a child to find out whether they have a particular genetic condition looks like one way that you do that. So I'm not persuaded that genetic testing in childhood does violate the right to an open future or is unjustified. But it remains something that's deeply controversial in the West. And remember, what we're talking about here is not making prenatal decisions, but postnatal diagnostic tests. Okay. And I'll finish there. Okay. Yeah.
A couple of things, really, particularly on savior siblings.
Yeah.
Also on counts. And savior siblings. The humanity formulation, as such, if it applies to the child that is selected, can be defeated in the ways you have shown. But I've applied it to the child, to the embryos that were deselected or discarded. There, you actually did treat that entity as solely as instrumental. So that's
Yeah.
so that was Kant and Xavier siblings, but it's not on the one that's selected. It's on the ones that weren't selected. Then the second thing is, I don't think we've had Xavier siblings long enough, but when they've all grown up to be adults. Now, scenario number one, the Xavier sibling has saved the brother. Now, they're now 50. Well, we haven't got that yet. But suppose Zion's brother is now 50. He's got renal failure. He needs a transplant.
Yeah.
Then there is a hopelessly strong pressure for Zion to donate his kidney.
Yeah.
Now that's something we rarely touch on. But I think if you actually follow the argument right to the end, say 50 years time, then that pressure to donate is, I would say, very. But even if it wasn't Zion who was the one that, even if it wasn't the brother that saved him that renal trouble, end-stage renal failure, even if it's the other way around, then it means that the brother who saved him the first time will also be under horrendous pressure to save him the second time. So I think these are things we need to think about.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think the response, in effect, to the first worry is simply to deny that embryos are persons and thus candidates for ends. But the implanted embryo, in being born, acquires the status of personhood. And then the question is, how are they regarded or treated by their parents? And if they're treated and regarded solely as the instrument to the saving of the sibling's life, that would be wrong. The second worry is actually nicely dramatized in the Judy Picoult novel. That if you find, somebody find online what it's called, because My Sister's Keeper. My Sister's Keeper. Thank you. Just something popped into my head. My Sister's Keeper. It's nicely done in the form of each chapter is written by one of the characters in the family. So there's the sort of mother, the sick sibling, then the saviour sibling. And indeed, it's just the case that the saviour sibling is put under pressure by the parents to undergo ever more intrusive and invasive procedures to save the sibling's life. And I think there's finally an objection saying enough of this, the saviour sibling saying enough is enough. I've done enough to try to save my sister's life. I'm not obligated to do any more. What's interesting is, of course, that you've also got the Gillick type problem in that children don't have any choice. They can't consent to the procedures. So the extraction of tissue from them can't be subject to their consent to give it or not. Whereas obviously an adult can say, look, I'm just not going to donate my kidney here, even though I recognize it would be necessary to ensure the life of my sibling, even if I recognize the pressure on me to do so. It has always worried people about saviour siblings that the use of their tissues would be without their consent, and there has to be strict constraints on what can be done with them. But there's a general worry. I think you're right about longitudinal studies here. We just don't know. I mean, fertility treatment now itself is so young that some of the evidence against fertility treatment is only now being gathered in terms of claims about, for instance, cryogenic freezing of embryos and gametes, that it may carry with it attendant risks. And we may yet find that there are real problems about the identity and psychological well-being of those who come to realize as adults that they were created solely to save the life of a sibling. I agree. We need more evidence. Yeah. Yes, go on.
Just a quick question. How would you say the difference between, genetically select someone and abortion? After I know that my child has Down syndrome, then I choose abortion, and I intentionally choose my embryos not to have it.
First, a story. One of the first PGD license decisions I made or was involved in making was in circumstances where the HFEA would get an application from a family, a particular family who wanted PGD for their prospective child. Now we license a general condition. This was from an Orthodox Jewish couple who were morally opposed to abortion, but not to PGD. So they wanted PGD because they did not want to undergo a termination, an abortion. And I remember being puzzled by this, but it derived from their belief that there was a difference between the discarding of embryos created outside the womb and the destruction of a fetus in the womb. So they saw a moral relevance, a morally relevant distinction between what, as it were, is in literally in vitro, in a piece of glass, in a glass dish, does not have the moral status that an implanted embryo does. So one response is that IVF, which necessarily involves the creation of surplus embryos which are discarded, there's a morally relevant difference between that and once implanted and becoming a viable fetus, destroying that is killing. And to that extent, abortion is arguably wrong, but discarding embryos before they're implanted is not wrong.
So isn't it even morally better to prevent killing here?
To prevent?
Killing your embryo, your fetus. I mean, so we should probably allow people to use genetic engineering to choose certain kind of traits.
Yes, yeah, yes. If you thought, well, certainly, if you thought that the choice was between the choice to avoid having a child with a disability was either termination or PGD, PGD might well be seen as morally permissible by many. But abortion is not. I should quickly add, by the way, that there's a slight complication here. I say the discarding of embryos. For PGD, you might create somewhere in the region of half a dozen embryos, so 6 embryos. That's normally thought of as enough. You've both got to pick an embryo that's viable. In other words, would survive once put back and that doesn't have the genetic condition. And the difficulty of PGD is that you can't always guarantee that that will be the case. But couples who go for PGD can allow that embryos that they're not selecting could be used for other purposes. That would include research, for instance. So non-viable embryos could be donated by a couple for research, and you can get valuable research on what makes pregnancy successful, the mechanisms for transmitting genetic mutations. There's a real puzzle as to whether or not couples are disposed to donate viable mutation-free embryos that are not needed in their case to other couples for their fertility treatment. On the whole, couples tend to be not well disposed to do that because I mean, it could be very painful and difficult to see another couple have your embryo, but your own fertility treatment not to work. Anecdotally, the research that we've done is many couples find that excruciatingly painful, to donate embryos to others. Yeah, but by the way, I'm not endorsing the view that, though I hold it, that there is a morally relevant difference between abortion and PGD. I'm well aware that there are many people who hold PGD to be immoral because you discard embryos, and they regard that as impermissible and of the same order as abortion. So in the UK, religious groups are very opposed to fertility treatment for just that reason. because they think it involves the destruction of viable human lives. So all the churches, sorry, not all the churches, a number of churches are opposed to it. Though we have on the HFEA a leading figure in the Church of England. So the Church of England tends to favour fertility treatment, even while they're worried about abortion. Yeah.
But just I guess HFEA, you're allowed to have a non-viable embryonic research up to the 6 days, right? So in terms of clinical, you don't really see that.
Yeah. This is the subject of much current scientific discussion, because the limit beyond which it's permissible to keep an embryo was decided by the Warnock Committee on what most saw as fairly morally arbitrary grounds. It was at that point where they said twinning was no longer possible. It's the development of the primitive streak. And it was thought by the committee that beyond that point you had something with moral status close to a person, before that not. So Warnock herself was quite honest that they just plucked a date out of the air and said, that's it, you can't keep the embryo alive beyond that point. The real concern we had some years ago was the creation of so-called hybrid embryos, which were embryos that had 99.95% human DNA, but 0.05 animal DNA. And those were embryos created purely for research on viability. But the very straightforward and strict constraint was that they were not going to be kept alive for beyond a certain period, because of certain worries that people had that you were creating monsters that were going to be implanted. So certain embryos just can't be implanted or put back in the womb. Yeah, yeah. Yes?
A question about the parity of parental value. I found, or I think there's maybe this analogy, because if non-identity problem is correct, then modifying gene would not be benefiting a specific children, right? But if you improve a children's environment, then this is beneficial.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. It is a standard challenge to the claim of parity. It's certainly both ways, in that that is, it makes sense to say that you could benefit somebody once in existence, but it sounds odd to say that you could benefit somebody by making certain genetic choices. Equally, you can worsen somebody's life once they're brought into existence, but it sounds odd to say that by, let's say, failing to do certain genetic enhancements, you're worsening someone's life, because were you not to do those things, they wouldn't exist as the person who comes into existence. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yes. I mean, the parity strikes me as generally dubious anyway. I should say as well that in the background also, and this came up in the kind of Michael Sandel criticism, that what's wrong with making these kinds of genetic choices is that it displays a certain kind of hubris or arrogance by parents instead of a resignation to the giftedness of the child. I heard that many years ago, before Sandel's book came out, actually by a colleague of mine at St Andrews, John Haldane. And John is a Catholic philosopher and deeply opposed to genetic enhancement. Certainly on the grounds that it involves creation of surplus embryos. But his view, I remember, was, look, having a child is a gift. And you don't send, you don't send gifts back saying, I want a better version. You accept what you are given. Now, he was able to say that because he has religious beliefs and he thinks children are a gift from God. So you just accept what you get. But Sandel has problems with the notion of giftedness precisely because he denies it implies a commitment to God. But it's a foreshadowing of the non-identity problem in the sense that, look, this is not a matter that's open to comparative choice. The child that comes is the child that comes. That's who the child is, and you don't, as it were, ask for it to be sent back and changed. Accept what you get. Yeah. Go on. Hon.
Thanks for the wonderful lecture. I have a question about Benneker. You mentioned Schopenhauer,
Yes.
who was influenced by Buddhism. And of course, on the Buddhist, at least some version of the Buddhist view, life is actually a sea of suffering. So, if people's life is much shorter than now, and also lots of disease, illnesses, and so on. So I think that would be plausible in what was Benneker's conclusion would be the empirical point, the third point would be plausible in that kind of world. However, in today's world, at least at the more affluent part of the world, I was thinking maybe his view is less plausible. Even having regarded to asymmetry between pre-existence and continued existence.
Yes.
What's your take on that?
Yeah, no. I think the Schopenhauerian position and the one that David inherits, it's actually, David is Jewish, so he quotes the same joke that Robert Nozick uses in Anarchy, State and Utopia about the two Josephs say, oh, God, isn't life awful, better we were never born, and the other one says, but who is so lucky? And it is a view about the misery that each of us suffers in this life, such that each of us can express a regret that we have been brought into existence. The Buddhist position seems to be slightly different, and it's the view that you should cut yourself loose from subscription to the importance of your own individual existence. You shouldn't think things matter to you. So there are people, Galen Strawson, for instance, is very, I think, influenced by that Buddhist view of losing the importance of individual identity. Think of yourself as just an impersonal, a part of an impersonal whole. And I think Parfit thinks that in some sense. His particular view of personal identity is an attempt to get you to lose that sense that what matters is this person here. I think David is very particular, though. It's a view about, a Schopenhauerian view about the misery of each individual existence. And on the empirical point, he does think even the affluent suffer the small but accumulated miseries of everyday existence. I was with at a conference where David was citing, it's that time of day. His particular example was the pain of a full bladder. And he said, you wouldn't believe how many times in the day you have that pain. It's quickly forgotten, but he said at the time was irritating, even excruciating. He said, add those up across a week, add those up across a month. It adds to a miserable existence. Now, he used that example and everyone burst out laughing and said, oh, come on, David, you can't possibly have evidence from full bladders do the work of persuading us it would be better we never existed. And he said, yeah, add them all up. There's a lot more going on in your life that's terrible than you realize, and you just forget about it. We're incurable, forward-looking optimists who misremember how bad yesterday was. And he genuinely believes that. We wake up each morning somehow facing life afresh with a poor memory of how bad yesterday was. But if we were able to look and see how bad each and every day was, even for the rich, even for the powerful, we would decide on the whole far better never to come into existence. Now, incidentally, the empirical evidence does an important work in his argument, because he thinks that it's sufficient to show that not just that life is bad, but it's very bad. Okay? So it's not just that you count the harms and discount the benefits, because those harms might be minor. So it could be the case that, for instance, the harms of existence, which are allowed to count when contemplating bringing into existence, are on the whole taken in aggregate so small and minor that it really doesn't persuade you not to bring it into existence. His view is actually, empirically, they are terrible.
Isn't that just a talk about quantity but not quality? So we can distinguish between quantity and quality, right?
Yes.
You are just talking about the sum of number. When we're talking about experience, maybe some could outweigh any number of, I don't know, some.
Yeah, there's also this very interesting question. If you, again, I remember him being challenged on this. If his view is that you misremember the pains and tribulations of your life, what happened yesterday, to what extent are they still pains? I mean, if you genuinely don't experience them any longer as painful moments of your past, it's odd to think that they're still harms that count up in making the life as a whole a bad one. And it may be that we have evolved as creatures who tend not to carry forward into the future this past memory of the little pains and harms we suffered. But then they're no longer pains and harms to us. And life as a whole is experienced as good.
Yeah. But the argument about quality and quantity, isn't that an updated version of, let's be Socrates discontented, but rather than satisfied of John Mr.
Sorry.
Referring to what you say about Benedict talking about optimist bias. So I sometimes find it puzzling. I mean, on his description of human nature, it is like, yes, okay, from a certain perspective, life is suffering bad, very bad. But then somehow we are equipped with some psychological mechanism that will underrate all the suffering. So the issue is that there are two perspectives, and I mean exactly which perspective we should, or it is more appropriate for we to adopt to assess whether life is worth starting or worth continuing.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, he's insistent in the book and in discussion of it that the question of whether to continue a life is entirely different from that of whether to start a life. And it's not the case that the balance of harms and benefits that would be enough to persuade us not to start a life is the same balance that would lead us, once alive, to end it. So it's clear that when people undergo terrible harms in their life, and there are some standard examples that are used, people who've undergone the most awful, miserable existence, they will not end their lives. Even though you would think stepping outside and acting as an impersonal evaluator and judge of the life, you'd have to say, why lead that life? That's a terrible one. From the inside, people make a decision not to end it. And he's clear that people feel that way once alive is not enough to show that it wouldn't have been a good thing never to start that life. So there's a question both of being an incurable optimist, of interpreting your life in a certain way, but also that the questions of what counts as reason to start a life is distinct from what counts as the reasons to end it once you've started it. You might think, for instance, that the reasons to end a life once you've started it have to be that the life is intolerably bad, really, really bad. But it might be good enough never to start a life that the balance was just against, that the harms just outweighed the goods. Think about life as in stages, and think of it as, you live only 60 years. The 30 years of it are miserable. The next 30 years are great, but just marginally less good than the harms you've suffered for the first 30 years. That might be a good enough reason never to start the life. It wouldn't be good enough reason once you had begun your life and knowing how it was going to end it.
We have never started that course, and we have never experienced any happiness or miserable, so any reason that is bad would be enough for us not to start. But once we have lived,
Yes.
we do have some happiness.
Yeah.
So when we do the
Yeah.
sum or
Yes.
together, then it
Yeah.
will
No, you're right.
cost even more for us.
Yes. Yeah. I think that part of his reason is that you're actually right, that benefits in prospect for a life don't count in favor of bringing into existence, but benefits in prospect once you're alive do count against any harms you might suffer. But he's trying to resist the view that given that people don't, as it were, commit suicide quickly and easily, even those who've suffered some terrible experiences in their life, he won't allow that to count against the view that you shouldn't have brought that life into existence. So that John Smith, once he comes into existence, endures such terrible miseries, but still doesn't end his life, doesn't show you that it would have been better never to have brought John Smith into existence. Otherwise, someone's going to say, but look, people, if you're right, David, people should just be committing suicide now. You should persuade them now to end their lives because it's just going to be terrible. He's going to say, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that you didn't have the choice about whether to come into existence. Had you the choice, you should have chosen not to have been brought into existence. But once you exist, you're going to be committed to staying alive and not to ending your life. Yeah.
I think of a scenario which would like to comment. This is from the news. It's a 33-year-old man who suffers from acute leukemia. And then there's an 8-year-old son who matched his bone marrow.
Yes.
But then the 8-year-old son need to gain weight. Namely, needs to gain from 30 to 46.5 within 2 months.
Right.
So it's actually, and they actually did it, and then they comment that the son is pious in saving his father.
Yeah.
So, but I feel that it's something not morally correct, or something that the son should be forced to gain weight in order to save, just to save his son.
Yeah. Yes. Why do you worry about that?
Because the son may not have the autonomy in deciding, but and he may not appreciate the possible harm done to his health within these 2 months.
Yeah.
But then the force of the culture, and then it would be forcing him to do so to save a life.
There is a very real and difficult question about the extent to which choices are still free if you are subject to extraordinary family pressures to behave in certain ways. Going back to your, when Hashmi grows up, he might still be able to save his sibling by donating an organ. And it's one thing to be a kind of spontaneous altruistic donor of organs, another to be subject to quite powerful family pressures. This is what you owe your brother, or this is what you owe your father. This is what it means to be a member of a family. And it's obviously the case in China where the notion of filial piety, filial obligations exerts a kind of pressure it doesn't in the West. You're going to have real kind of pressures on individuals within families to do certain kinds of things. And less so in the West, it seems to me.
But I wonder if his family is in the West, would the doctor be allowed to apply a court order to protect his son?
Yes. Yeah. No. I should say that there are cases of intrafamilial gamete donation as well that raises real issues. So we know that in some cultures it's standard for fertile sisters to offer eggs to their infertile sibling, and also for we had to worry about that as to whether it violated a prohibition on incest. So yeah, I think it's too easy to say these choices are free, autonomous, and considered when being subject to family pressures to behave in certain kinds of ways can be very overwhelming and powerful and difficult to resist, even to the extent, as you said, putting yourself at risk of serious harms. Yeah. In the case of standard savior siblings, most of the work is done while they're minors. If you're going to save these children, you have to act early. And that's why the law is very clear in the UK. You can't go beyond the use of umbilical stem cells. You can't use organs. You can't use spinal tissue. It's forbidden because that's seen as exposing the child to improper risks, even to save another life. Just not allowed.
Really minor observation. Benatar reminded me of the Woody Allen joke of reviewing a bad restaurant. And he says, well, the food's terrible, but at least the portions are small.
Which is good Jewish humor.
Yeah.
Very good Jewish humor. Yes. Yeah. You might be interested, Tom, that the first time I heard David defend the view was at the conference you organized here in Hong Kong in 1999, where he developed a version of it. And Bonnie Steinbach was present and said, I think the question was, how do you reconcile that with your Jewish faith, David? I still remember that question, which is highly improper, because David is very, very serious in his Jewish identity, but does not regard his philosophical views as following from or inconsistent with his Jewish commitments. And yet, it's a very, very Jewish position that your life is miserable and really is a veil of tears and pains. And, it would have been so much better if we never came into existence. But David is a person who likes life, so it's there's something odd about it. Yeah. I mean, you make the best of it, even though it would have been, you shrug your shoulders in a kind of ironic Jewish way and say, look, this is what we have, let's make the best of it. But that was really mean of God to do that, to bring us into existence. What a rotten person.
Well, there's a really nice empirical study. I'm a psychologist. They did a study about the quality of life among parents who have children with autism. Yeah. So autism and all the lower high functioning, etc., autism spectrum. But what they really found is that the severity of autism doesn't really affect the parents' lifestyle or the quality of life, because it's all about the way how they perceive their children's disabilities. It's nothing to do with their severity. So they're saying, now my children's low functioning after treatment, he's better, now I'm happier, so it makes sense. That person could be happier even though the child was really low functioning.
No, it's a very good point, and Han mentioned that I was on a Nuffield Council on Bioethics working party, which was addressing the issue of severely premature babies. These babies with gestational ages of 23, 24 weeks, and they can now be kept alive, at least on, in neonatal intensive care units. But there's very high risk that those children will develop severe disabilities because of their low gestational age. So one of the questions is whether or not you should use extraordinary means to keep those babies alive. And what was very clear to us was parents felt under enormous pressure to keep the babies alive and would resist the suggestions by doctors that we just cease treatment and turn off the machine. And yet, many of the parents we interviewed told us after probably we made a mistake. It's very hard for a parent to say, better that our child had not survived with those terrible disabilities. And they didn't mean that in, I think, an entirely selfish way, that their lives were worsened. They just were very well aware as empathizing parents that these children were going to have pretty awful lives. And we wanted to suggest that the happiness of the two lives, parents and child, were importantly intertwined. Parents' lives go better if their children are of a certain kind, and vice versa. But it's very hard to be open about the sort of choices you can make. And that's why PGD can seem a much more acceptable approach, because you don't have to face those terrible, difficult choices of either termination or children being born with the disability but requiring extraordinary means to keep them alive. If they could avoid that by choosing PGD, why not? Yeah.
but I think it's actually very difficult to determine harm. I mean, I know we talked about harm last time, or harm, or unhappiness, misery, happiness, and that sort of thing. I remember reading a study that a lot of people, it's in a medical journal, unfortunately I forgot what, it's about self-assessment of their satisfaction with their status in people who are locked in. In fact, the time when you said about consent, you actually meant locked in. A locked in person is completely aware, but is completely unable to actually make any responses to the environment. Think, was it the diving bell and the butterfly? Yes, that's locked in. And somehow these people who have either subsequently got out of their locked-in syndrome via various means, they actually, is this incurable optimism to them. Whilst even locked in, actually are less pessimistic about the future, are less horrified about what they're actually undergoing or experiencing whilst locked in, then all of us would think, come on, you're locked in, it must be horrendously terrible, but we are actually outside their world.
No, it's very true. And I mean, some of the standard cases that are appealed are, for instance, those who were in the concentration camps in the Second World War, whose lives were just intolerably miserable day after day after day, and yet reported that you just struggled to stay alive, even though there was no prospect of your misery being relieved, and even though each day was appalling. People did not commit suicide. They just said, maybe tomorrow it will get better. Yeah. You're making a move on me, hon.
Well, this is the end of today's lecture, and together with the two lectures last time and the two lectures today, Dave has done a marvelous job for us, and I would invite you to thank him.
Thank you.